Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive. Today we're looking at something we all do all the time, giving and receiving. But we're going to go a little deeper, look at the psychology behind it all.
It's really interesting when you start peeling back the layers, isn't it? There's a lot more to it than meets the eye.
Exactly. And to help us unpack it all, we've got a really diverse set of sources for this deep dive. We've got a blog post, a success coach's perspective, a psychologist's take, an article on giving styles, and even a thread from Reddit.
Wow, quite the mix.
I know, right?
Yeah.
So to kick things off, let's start with this blog post by Beverly Bowers on 60andMe. She talks about something I think a lot of us can relate to, that sometimes receiving a gift can feel, I don't know, awkward or even kind of guilty.
Oh, for sure. And Bowers even points out how different that is from the pure joy kids feel when they get gifts. It makes you wonder what changes as we grow up, doesn't it?
It really does. And Bowers actually talks about how when she gets a nice gift, she sometimes catches herself thinking about the monetary value, and if she gave something of equal worth back. It's almost like we start keeping score without even realizing it.
Like, we need everything to be perfectly balanced, even in casual exchanges. That reminds me of the whole matcher mentality we sometimes see.
Oh, interesting connection. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Bowers shares this story about how she started giving thanks in unique ways, like she helped a caregiver who was struggling, a friend who was estranged from her child, and even a homeless person. And it wasn't always about money. It was about offering different kinds of support.
It's a great example of how giving goes beyond material things, isn't it? It can be about our time, our skills, just listening to someone.
Absolutely. Have you ever felt that way, like uncomfortable receiving a gift? What do you think makes it harder for some people to be on the receiving end?
That's a really great question to reflect on. I think it can reveal a lot about us, even maybe some deeper self-worth stuff we're not totally aware of.
Deeper self-worth stuff. Okay. I'm going to hold on to that thought. But before we go there, I want to bring in what Danielle Colley, a success coach, has to say about this whole giving and receiving thing. She writes about how much she loves giving gifts, but she acknowledges that receiving can be tough for a lot of people.
And she makes this really intriguing link between being able to receive and a person's sense of worthiness. She even shares this example, kind of surprising, about a client who struggled to receive pleasure, like during sex.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I did not see that coming. But when you put it that way, it makes you think, right? If someone struggles to see something as basic as pleasure, there might be something deeper going on.
It really does make you wonder, could difficulty receiving be a sign of some underlying self-worth issues we might not even realize are there?
I'm definitely putting a pin in this self-worth idea. But now I want to shift gears a bit and get a psychologist's take on all of this. Nazreen Hanifi, she offers a clinical perspective on why giving and receiving can be, well, complicated sometimes.
And she makes some really compelling points. Like, she talks about how fear of scarcity can hold us back from giving. If we're always worried about not having enough, it's hard to share what we do have.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And it's not just material things, right? It could be scarcity of time, energy, emotional availability, all sorts of things.
Absolutely. And Hanifi also points out how being too self-focused can make it harder to prioritize the needs of others. And then on the flip side, how receiving can actually threaten our feelings of being self-reliant, and even worthy.
Wait, so you're saying that for some people, being on the receiving end can make them feel less worthy?
As strange as it sounds, yeah. It can kind of challenge that image we have of ourselves as strong and independent, almost like a blow to the ego in a way.
Okay, starting to see how this can get pretty complex. Like we get so stuck in these roles of giver and receiver that we forget that healthy relationships are all about a balance of both.
You're hitting on a key point there. It's not about staying rigidly in one role or the other. It's about finding that sweet spot where everyone benefits. And the good news is, Hanifi believes that both giving and receiving are skills we can actually cultivate.
So there's hope for those of us who struggle with one side of the equation. That's good to hear. Now, before we go any further, I want to delve into some specific types of givers and takers. This article from the Lemonade blog does a great job breaking down Adam Grant's research on reciprocity styles. And it's more nuanced than just good guys and bad guys, He talks about givers, takers, and matchers.
Oh, Grant's work is so insightful. He found that, get this, givers can actually be the best and worst performers in the workplace.
Hold on, how is that even possible? Can you unpack that a little?
Sure. It all comes down to the type of giver someone is. There are selfless givers, the ones who put everyone else first, always, and end up burning out. Then there are Otherish givers, who are generous, but they're also strategic. They find ways to help others that also benefit themselves in the long run.
So it's not about being a doormat. It's about making sure everyone benefits, right? Like putting on your own oxygen mask before helping others, as they say.
Exactly. And here's another interesting finding from Grant's research. Takers often struggle in the long run because their selfishness kind of catches up with them. They get a reputation and people start avoiding them.
So even if takers seem to win in the short term, karma eventually comes for them. Now, thinking about your own interactions, which reciprocity style do you think you lean towards? Giver, taker, or matcher?
It's a good question for all of us to consider. Becoming aware of our own tendencies is like the first step to making more conscious choices about how we interact with others.
Couldn't agree more. And speaking of conscious choices, the Lemonade blog also offers some practical tips on becoming a more successful giver. And what I appreciate is that it's not about blindly giving more, it's about giving in a way that works for you and actually helps others.
And they have this great tip about 5-minute favors. It's all about finding little ways to help without overextending yourself.
Oh, I love that. Small acts of kindness can make a big difference. They also talk about being strategic when asking for help.
I know that can feel a little counterintuitive, especially for those of us who identify as givers. But think about it. By asking for help, you're giving someone else the opportunity to give. Everyone wins.
That builds stronger relationships too, right? Shows of vulnerability, trust. Another tip that stood out to me was this idea of chunking your giving. So instead of scattering it throughout the week, dedicate specific times to it.
It's like a way to make your giving feel more impactful, right? Almost like you're hacking your brain for good.
Exactly, I love that. They also suggest specializing in a certain type of favor, so you don't get burnt out trying to be everything to everyone.
It's all about setting those healthy boundaries, which is crucial for any giver. And last but not least, they have some advice on how to recognize and manage interactions with takers.
That's important. We already talked about how takers can drain your energy and take advantage. Got to protect yourself.
You do. You have to be smart about who you give your time and energy to.
All right, now I want to bring it back to Danielle Colley, the success coach, because she has some great tips on becoming better at receiving. I like that she recognizes how uncomfortable it can be and emphasizes that it's a process. Small steps.
One of her suggestions that really stuck with me was to practice noticing and being grateful for even the smallest acts of kindness.
Oh yeah, that's so important. Instead of dismissing compliments or downplaying someone's effort, we can take a moment to really acknowledge it, appreciate the thought behind it.
Exactly. She also encourages people to own their compliments, to let themselves feel valued. Quiet those inner critics that say we're not worthy.
It's about that self-compassion we were talking about earlier. Her last tip is about doing daily gratitude exercises to boost happiness and reduce anxiety.
Gratitude is powerful, isn't it? When we focus on what we have, it creates this feeling of abundance that can really counteract those feelings of scarcity that hold us back from both giving and receiving.
Okay, we've covered a lot. Which of these strategies resonates most with you? What's one small step you could take today to get more comfortable with giving or receiving, whichever side you struggle with more?
It's all about finding what works for you. Think about where you feel the most resistance and then experiment.
Great advice. Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, let's look at that Reddit thread I mentioned. It's from someone who's really grappling with these dynamics in their social life. They talk about it in terms of like assigned roles, the giver and the receiver. They've noticed that in almost every interaction, people fall into one or the other.
And they make a really insightful observation that a good social interaction is one where both people are good givers.
That is so true. It's not about one person constantly giving and the other just taking. It's about that sweet spot where everyone benefits. Reminds me of the Otherish giving idea. It's not self-sacrifice. It's about helping in a way that nourishes everyone involved.
And that brings us back to Hanifai's point about vulnerability and openness. For both giving and receiving to be truly transformative, we have to let go of some control. Be authentic, let ourselves be seen.
Show up as our true selves without being afraid of judgment or rejection. And accept generosity without feeling like we owe something back immediately.
Beautifully put. It's in those moments of genuine connection that the real magic happens. Now, before we move on to part 2 of our deep dive, let's recap what we've learned so far.
Okay, key takeaways time. We've learned that giving and receiving, they're way more than just simple transactions. They're connected to our psychology, our self-worth, how we navigate the world.
We've also discovered that there are practical strategies to become more skilled at both giving and receiving, which can lead to better relationships, more happiness, even success in our personal and professional lives. And we explored those different reciprocity styles, givers, takers, and matchers. Understanding these can help us navigate social interactions more effectively.
We also highlighted how important self-awareness is. Recognizing our own tendencies and understanding what motivates others can make a huge difference in how we experience these dynamics.
And of course, self-care is vital. Being a good giver doesn't mean sacrificing your well-being. It's about finding a sustainable approach that allows you to contribute without bringing yourself out.
Like that saying, you can't pour from an empty cup.
Mhm.
Got to take care of yourself first.
Exactly. And finally, we emphasize the power of vulnerability and openness. Both giving and receiving ask us to let our guard down a bit and embrace the beauty of human connection.
I love how you put that. Now, as we get ready for part 2, I want to leave you with a question to think about. What small act of giving could you do today to brighten someone's day? And what small act of kindness could you allow yourself to receive with grace and gratitude? Think about that, and we'll be back with more insights in part 2.
Yeah, those are some really good questions to think about as we keep, you know, keep exploring this topic.
It's amazing, isn't it? Like something as simple as giving and receiving, it can have such a big impact on our lives.
Really emphasizes how connected we all are, you know? Like these small actions can ripple out and affect our relationships, our happiness, even our sense of purpose.
Totally. It's like this invisible web of energy and emotion that connects us all.
And as we become more aware of those connections, I think it opens up like a whole new level of understanding and possibility.
Okay, so I've already covered a lot of ground, but I feel like we've barely scratched the surface. There's so much to unpack with this idea of giving and receiving.
There really is. And one thing I think is important to emphasize is that there's no one right way to be a giver or a receiver. What works for one person might not work for another, and that's totally fine.
That's a really good point. It's about finding what feels authentic and sustainable for you.
Right.
And that might even change depending on the situation or the relationship you're in.
Exactly. There's a whole spectrum of giving and receiving styles, and each one has its own strengths and challenges. The key is to be self-aware, like you were saying, and make conscious choices about how we engage in these dynamics.
So it's less about labeling ourselves as a certain type and more about understanding the nuances of how we behave, right?
That's it. It's about being mindful of our motivations, recognizing our triggers, being open to experimenting with different approaches.
I love that. It's like we're all on this journey of discovery, learning how to give and receive in ways that feel meaningful and empowering.
I like that, a journey of discovery. And as we continue on this journey, I think it's important to challenge some of the assumptions and misconceptions we have about giving and receiving.
Okay, like what are some of the things we often get wrong about these dynamics?
Well, one big one is this idea that giving is always selfless and receiving is always selfish. But that's just not true.
You mean there can be selfish motivations behind giving?
Absolutely. Sometimes people give to boost their ego, to gain recognition, or even, to manipulate others. And on the flip side, there can be really selfless reasons for receiving.
Interesting. Can you give me an example of a selfless reason for receiving?
Sure. Imagine someone who's going through a rough time. Maybe they lost someone they love or they're having financial troubles. Allowing others to help them, to offer support and comfort, can actually be an act of courage and generosity on their part.
Wow, yeah. So by accepting help, they're giving others a chance to express their care and compassion.
Exactly. It becomes this reciprocal act that strengthens the bond between people.
Things are getting complex, aren't they?
They can. And another misconception is that giving and receiving are always about, material things.
Yeah.
But we've already seen how giving can be so much more than that.
Right, like offering your time, your skills, your attention, emotional support. Those can be incredibly valuable gifts.
Absolutely. And receiving can also involve non-material things like accepting compliments, acknowledging someone's effort, just being present with them.
So it's more about the intention, the energy behind the exchange, not just the stuff itself.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that human need for connection and finding ways to fulfill that need for both ourselves and for others.
I really like that perspective. Takes the pressure off, having to find the perfect gift or reciprocate in some perfectly balanced way.
For sure. It's about finding a balance that feels authentic and, sustainable for everyone involved.
Okay, so we've talked about some misconceptions, but what about the challenges? What makes it hard to navigate these dynamics effectively?
Well, I think one challenge is just recognizing when we're out of balance. Sometimes we get so caught up in our roles, the giver or the receiver, that we lose sight of the bigger picture.
It's like we become blind to our own patterns.
Exactly. That's why self-awareness is so important. We have to step back and look at our own behavior and ask ourselves, am I giving too much? Am I receiving enough? Am I creating a dynamic that feels healthy and sustainable?
Those are really good questions to reflect on. And if we realize we are out of balance, what can we do to create more harmony in our relationships?
Well, the first step is just to acknowledge the imbalance. Once we see it, then we can start to explore the reasons behind it.
Okay, so let's say someone realizes they're always giving and never receiving. What might be some reasons for that?
Oh, it could be a lot of things. Maybe a fear of being seen as needy or vulnerable. Maybe a belief that they're not worthy of receiving. It could be a pattern they learned growing up. Or a combination of all those things.
That makes sense. What about the opposite? Always receiving, never giving. What might be going on there?
Again, lots of possibilities. It could be a sense of entitlement, a lack of awareness of others' needs, or maybe a fear of rejection or failure.
So we all have these unique beliefs and experiences that shape how we approach this whole giving and receiving thing.
That's right. And the more we understand those underlying factors, the more power we have to make conscious choices about how we want to engage.
I love that.
Yeah,
It's like we're taking back control of our own behavior and creating relationships that reflect our values.
that's exactly it. And it's an ongoing process, requires self-reflection, honesty, and a willingness to question our own assumptions.
So true. It's not a one-time fix. It's something we need to be mindful of in all our interactions.
And as we get better at giving and receiving, we not only strengthen our relationships, but we also, cultivate a deeper sense of self-worth and fulfillment.
I'm curious, what are some of the biggest rewards you've seen people experience when they really figure this out? Like, what positive outcomes can come from finding that balance?
Oh, so many. I've seen people experience more joy, deeper sense of connection, more confidence, and a stronger sense of purpose in their lives.
It's amazing. Like, by learning how to give and receive in a healthy way, we unlock a whole new level of happiness and well-being.
Exactly. And it's something that's available to everyone, no matter where they are on their journey.
Well, I'm feeling pretty inspired right now. Like, we've uncovered this whole hidden dimension of human interaction.
Me too. I'm excited to see what other insights emerge as we continue to explore this topic.
Okay, so before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, I think it's good to take a moment to, appreciate how far we've come. We've explored the psychology, debunked some misconceptions, identified the challenges, and even talked about strategies for finding more balance.
We've learned that it's not just about material things, but about all sorts of actions, emotions, even energies we exchange with each other.
And we've really emphasized how important it is to be self-aware, to be honest with ourselves, and to be willing to challenge our own assumptions.
It's been a rich and insightful conversation so far, and I'm eager to see where it takes us in the final part.
Me too. As we head into that final part, I want to leave you with this thought. What if the true gift of giving and receiving isn't in the act itself, but in the transformation that happens inside us, as we learn to do these things with more skill, more awareness, and more compassion? Stay tuned for more in part 3.
Wow, yeah. That's a really powerful question to sit with for a minute, isn't it? What if the real magic is in how giving and receiving change us?
It really makes you think about it differently, doesn't it? Like, maybe it's less about the actual act and more about the opportunity for growth, for deeper connection with ourselves and others.
I love that. It's like we're not just exchanging gifts or favors or whatever. We're exchanging something much deeper, like energy, emotions, even a little piece of ourselves.
And in that exchange, I think something really profound can happen. We can develop more empathy, feel more gratitude, even expand our understanding of what it means to be human. It's kind of beautiful when you think about it that way. All these little rituals of giving and receiving connect us in this web of compassion and understanding.
I love that image, and I think it gets at the heart of why this topic is so fascinating. It touches on something very fundamental about being human.
Totally. It's about so much more than just etiquette or social rules. It's about who we are at our core and how we connect with the world around us.
And the more aware we become of these dynamics, the more we can make choices that create a more fulfilling life, both for ourselves and for others.
Okay, so we've talked about this in a general sense, but I'm wondering how it all plays out in different areas of life. Like, how does this dynamic of giving and receiving show up in romantic relationships?
Ooh, that's a great question. And I think it's an area where things can get particularly tricky. There are a lot of nuances.
How so? What makes romantic relationships different in this regard?
Well, for one thing, they often involve a much higher level of emotional intensity and vulnerability, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Like we're letting our guard down, letting our partner see more of who we really are.
Exactly. And that can make finding the balance between giving and receiving both easier and harder in a way.
I'm not sure I follow. Can you explain that a bit more?
Sure. Think about it. That deep intimacy can create a space for incredible generosity and selflessness. We naturally want to make our partner happy, support them, nurture them.
It's like our hearts are overflowing and we want to give them everything.
Exactly. But that same intensity can sometimes backfire and lead to codependency, resentment, or those feelings of imbalance we were talking about earlier.
Okay, so then how do we find that balance? How do we make sure we're giving and receiving in ways that feel good and healthy in a romantic relationship?
Well, honestly, communication is key.
Okay.
Really open and honest communication with your partner about your needs, your desires, your expectations.
So like regular check-ins to make sure everyone's feeling fulfilled and appreciated.
That's the idea. And it's about actively expressing gratitude, both for the big things and the small things.
I love that. It's so easy to take our partners for granted, especially after we've been together for a while.
It really is. But those little gestures of appreciation, a thank you, a hug, telling them you admire something about them, it can make such a difference.
And it's not just about appreciating what they do for us.
All right.
It's also about letting ourselves receive their love and affection without pushing it away.
Yes, that's so important. It's easy to get caught up in our own insecurities, and we end up blocking the very thing we want most.
So we build walls around our hearts, even when the person we love most is trying to break through.
Unfortunately, sometimes yes. And it creates so much unnecessary pain and distance in the relationship.
So how do we let those walls down? How do we become more open to receiving love?
It starts with self-compassion, I think. Being kind to ourselves, acknowledging our fears, and remembering that we are worthy of love and belonging.
It's a good reminder. We can't expect our partner to fill a void that we haven't addressed within ourselves.
Absolutely. When we cultivate self-love, it becomes so much easier to receive love from others.
Like we're creating space inside ourselves to hold that love.
Beautifully said. And when that happens, the whole relationship dynamic shifts for the better.
It becomes more balanced, more harmonious, more fulfilling for everyone involved.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And isn't that what we all want in our relationships?
100%. Now, before we wrap up completely, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about this dynamic showing up in other areas of life. We talked about romantic relationships, but what about friendships, family, work, all those other connections?
It's a great point. The principles are the same, even if the context is a little different.
So no matter what kind of relationship we're talking about, it's still about finding that balance between giving and receiving.
That's it. It's about being aware of our own needs and the needs of others, and figuring out ways to create a dynamic that feels good for everyone.
And being open to giving and receiving in different ways, right? Acts of service, words of affirmation, gifts, quality time, physical touch, all of it.
Yes, exactly. And it's important to remember that these dynamics are always in flux, you know? What feels balanced today might not feel balanced a year from now.
That's so true. Our needs change. Our capacity to give and receive changes. Our relationships need to be flexible enough to adapt.
It's an ongoing dance, a constant negotiation, a beautiful unfolding.
I love that way of putting it. Well, as we come to the end of our deep dives today, I want to thank you for joining us on this journey. I hope this has given you some new insights into the whole giving and receiving thing.
It's been a pleasure talking about this with you. I hope it's inspired our listeners to be more mindful of these dynamics in their own lives.
Me too. And as we sign off, I want to leave everyone with this final thought. What if the greatest gift we can give ourselves and others is the gift of presence? Really seeing and being seen, connecting heart to heart, soul to soul.
What a beautiful sentiment to end on. I think you're right. It's in those moments of genuine connection that the real magic of giving and receiving comes alive.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. Until next time, keep diving deep.